and said, would I come and do 2 presentations? And at the back of my mind I said no, but then from my mouth came out yes. So I'm here after a 13-hour journey from Shillong yesterday, where I managed to get in. This is a presentation that I've done now for a few years, and I call it the South Asian Man. What I try and do is show my kind of body of work from the time I started in my early teens taking pictures into my photojournalism years and some of my personal projects. I try and explain my origins, and this is a photo that my father took of us in the hill station Almora, and tomorrow I will talk about his work, but I've thrown in some pictures here to contextualize who I am with this rather odd name, Pablo Bartholomew, which doesn't sound too Indian. So my father came as a refugee from Burma during the Second World War and walked across what Amitabh Ghosh's book, The Glass Palace, talks about, that journey, and ended up in Upper Assam in Lido, and then came to Delhi. My mother came from Pakistan, and they met in college. It's one of those college romances, and here I am, a product of that liaison. So I know a lot of you may know the geography, but since I've done this talk all over the world, I have these maps. The red dot is Lahore, and Sargodha is just an offshoot of Lahore, where my mother came from. This is her reading Fort, which is a journal out of Delhi, which was very, very active platform for writers in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s. My mother came to Delhi. We all know where that is, I'm sure. And her origins are from Cooch Behar, which is in the right-hand side triangle. The top dot, the bottom dot is Calcutta, and to the right is Chittagong, where we have relatives from her Bengali side. This is another portrait of my father. And he came from Tavoy, which is the lowest dot here, schooled in Rangoon, and then in the Second World War, when the Japanese were coming in, Burmese with Christian names had to flee. So from Mandalay, which is around here, he walked into India, into Upper Assam. Oops. It skips. Anyway, this is the first essay that I'm going to show you, which is on the morphine addicts that I did. And at a young age of 19, I won the World Press Photo Award. It's an 8-part story. It's a linear story on a morphine addict in a small hotel in Paharganj. And for those who don't know what and where Paharganj is, it's near the New Delhi railway station, and it's a tourist ghetto. It's a bit like what Colaba used to be in the 70s with Rex and Stiffel's Hotel, those of you who may remember. So this is a Danish girl, and there were many, many foreigners that were coming in. This was the sort of end of the hippie era and the rise of the junkie era, as I learned when I was still just out of high school. I didn't finish, and I used to hang out with a lot of people, a lot of these people, and doing some of the drugs that they did. Hijra from Hijras, and I've again put all this text for the audience that don't know what the term Hijras is. And again, some of these pictures were just shot, around my locality, a few houses away. I lived in a middle-class neighborhood in South Delhi called Changpura. This is in Bombay, in the Hijra quarters, which is, or was, it probably still is, around Shuklaji Street, which is in the Mohammad Ali Road area, Grant Road, Mohammad Ali Road area. Calcutta. Again, Falkland Road in Bombay. Again in Bombay, in the Shuklaji Street area, the opium dens. And pre-1984, the opium dens were still around, which then got dismantled once we became signatories to the International Narcotics Act. I came to Bombay when I was around 19. I started coming and I started to work in the movie industry. But what interested me about the movie industry was not doing the production stills for the production companies, which of course I did to find employment and work. But it was the people who were the support, like the old guys, the film extras, and of course the young man sitting there is still going strong, not as an extra, but as a money-making machine, Mr. Bachchan. Nafisa Ali in Janoon, but again, what interested me were the support, the hairdressers, the stuntmen, the special effects. That's in Film City, a bank of reflectors on a set, the dance girls, the stuntmen. And then as I started to photograph more and more, I started to see things that I was attracted to. And sleep is one of these themes that sort of attracted me a lot. And like in many countries in Asia, people sleep very easily everywhere, partly because they may be homeless. Chowpatty Beach, somewhere in Worli, on a pavement in Calcutta. And I started to photograph street professionals and professionals, like a roadside photo studio in Mohammad Ali Road area, bandmen, a gymnast in the Chinese area in Calcutta, a portable shooting range wala, paper toy walas, a Ferris wheel walas, whoops, something's going a little. I just want to stop for a bit and just explain. After I got thrown out of high school, I had this sort of outsider moment in the sense that I was sort of socially ostracized. And, you know, in the 70s, Delhi was a very small place, and everybody knew everybody, and so this Bartholomew kid was a misfit, and he'd gone a bit wrong. And the school principal actually called a parent-teacher meeting, and he sort of told all my school friends, parents, that I shouldn't be allowed in their house and things like that. So somewhere, some of this kind of affected me, and I sort of naturally started to gravitate to the people that I photographed, the fringe that I found. And of course, as a photographer, they were very interesting subject matter, and I think for even now, young photographers naturally gravitate towards eunuchs and prostitutes and the marginalized. And now, of course, it's been done so many times that the photo agency Magnum, whenever they receive a portfolio with, you know, work which has this sort of subject matter, they say, oh, this is from the yawn list. Again, in Bombay, I followed street children and the rag pickers a lot. Oops. Again, this is in the Mohammed Road area. So in that Shuklaji Street, Mohammed Road, you had eunuchs, the red light district, the opium dens. It was a very fertile area of Bombay, so densely packed with all these subcultures. I think the remote is a bit, that's of course again back at Chowpatty Beach. And I lived in one of these houses. I was lucky to find a room with an old Parsi lady for many years. I worked with Satyajit Ray. I was lucky to find work with him on one of his films, Shatranj Ke Khiladi. And at that time I started to explore Calcutta. Of course, I had a grandmother who lived there, and as a child we went every summer to visit her. So Calcutta was something as a city I was familiar with. But then when I came to start to work in it, the film set was one thing, but I wanted to look at the city. And again, the Chinese attracted me as this marginalized community, which were very prosperous, but did a very dirty work in leather. It smelled, there was squalor everywhere around. But it was something that, in their spirit, which attracted me, and I then did this body of work, which is probably the first sort of large photo documentation. So you have a lot of people who work in it who are Indians, Bihari, neighbor, UP, but it's all Chinese owned, or was at least then. Oops. Chinese New Year. This is the Chinese temple in Tangra, the area as it's known as Od Hapa. During New Year and Christmas, a lot of parties in the factories. Sorry, the remote is a bit... That's the last image from the Tangra series. After I worked on the film Gandhi as a stills photographer, I found enough money to go abroad to find a photo agency, and then my work kind of started to change. I started the personal documentation, and it became very busy because India, from about 83 to about, let's say, 92, or even later, 96, was always in the news, and the Western media was sort of greedy to get imaging, and I felt that factory. So in 1983 we had the Sikh separatist movement, Khalistan, and I started to document that. That's inside the Golden Temple, one of the Khalistanis holding up their passport. They were quite well organized. That's Sant Brindamwale, the spiritual head of one of the smaller gurdwaras, but he became the leader of the movement. That's during Operation Black Thunder, which is the second time the Sikhs occupied the Golden Temple. By then, there was an anti-terrorism squad formed called the SGP, Special Protection Group, and they were able to flush the militants out quite quickly and effectively, unlike during Operation Blue Star when Mrs. Gandhi sent the tanks in and made the whole Sikh community very angry, and for that reason lost her life. That's at the show of hands, and that's how many decisions were made at Anandpur Sahib, which is the second most important Gurdwara for the Sikh community. That's just a photo of the Golden Temple. And so I sort of started to become a documenter, or more like a visual historian. And this is when Mrs. Gandhi's body was in state. There was so many people coming into Teen Murti House that there were kind of stampedes and near riot situations. So here you can see a young Rajiv Gandhi and a very young Rahul Gandhi in taking the body at the Rajghat area where she was cremated. Mr. Gandhi's ashes at Teen Murti House. And then followed the horrors. The Hindu mobs attacked the Sikhs, and the paramilitary and even the army had to be called in. and many of the Sikh families lost their properties, they were looted, killed. And then many of them had to run for safety into community centers or schools to seek protection in numbers. And here's a Sikh man showing that he is an Indian with his license and his passport. Oops. That's inside the school as they huddle together. But then, Rajiv Gandhi came to power. I was a young photographer. In some ways, our families knew each other. Mrs. Gandhi knew my father. As I said, everybody knew everybody. And this is a time when the media in the West went crazy with thinking the new Messiah had arrived, and there was this great need for images. So I traveled with Rajiv Gandhi quite extensively because they found us a very useful conduit through my French-American photo agency to be able to channelize the images. I also did his state portraits, which are the first two on the top left-hand side. That's with Castro in Cuba, with Gorbachev in Moscow. Whoops. Again, Rajiv and Sonia and these around. And just as the elections were announced in '84, and Rajiv had just taken over unofficially as the head of the country, we had the Bhopal gas tragedy, for which I got the World Press Photo Award.
Pablo, that photograph at the back, I saw somebody claiming that Raghuraj had done that.
Yeah, there are no similars. There are 3 or 4 similar images.
Yeah, because I only remember yours, and I was surprised that...
Well, surprise, surprise. This is the place where all the carcasses of the dead cattle, which were sort of taken out of the city and then dumped. And the wards were absolutely full with patients. That's the factory in the background, and this is the slum area and the people around it. This is one of the pictures that I shot just a few days after the gas tragedy, and as many of you know, that the gas affected the eyes and the lungs. It worked on soft tissue. And that was 15 years later, the same 3 people.
You can see them.
And then Rajiv Gandhi lost his life in Sri Perumbudur to an LTT bomb. One of the other things that I did a lot in my news years was natural disaster. And Bangladesh was a country that I knew quite well because I started to go there late late 80s to work on a National Geographic story. And because I spoke Bengali, it was easy for me to sort of work. When I say spoke Bengali, I pidgin Bengali, but enough to navigate and get around. And, it's a country which is, the horrors of the world happen there, and it really shows what nature can do. And again, some of these talks I'd done for media students, so it was always interesting for me to show them how magazines ran the work. And again, in those days there were magazines that would give you pages and pages and pages, but unfortunately that's all pretty much changed. Of course, then in 1992 I started to document this because the demolition of the Babri Masjid was a slow process of the right-wing fundamentalists agitating over years, which culminated then finally into the destruction.
Will they smash up your camera now?
Yeah. And again, magazine. Mother Teresa and the Pope in Calcutta. And then when she died, I didn't photograph her very much, but while I was still doing a lot of news, I would always try and take off. And part of what sort of, as you were doing news and I became more and more successful, you could do photojournalism only so much, and there were other things that attracted me. And then as I was sort of in my 30s and growing older, questions about who I am, where do I come from, those sort of things started to emerge. And I started to think of ways of expressing myself, and I got a grant to go to America from a Rockefeller Foundation and decided it was really a visiting museum program, but I decided that I wanted to do some work, and I started to look at Indians in America. So this is in Southern California. They're big, huge farms, and mainly Sikh farmers growing alfalfa, or this Bengali surgeon in Napa Valley grew really prime grapes that went to some of the top wineries. Or you had raisin farmers. And it was like a road trip, so it was discovering America and my extended community. Yuba City is north of Sacramento, and it's known for the peach growing farmers, mainly again Sikhs. If those of you who've been to America, and when you fill out the form for the immigration, there's there's always one checkbox which says, are you going to any farmlands? Because many Indians just go and disappear. These are what they would call within the community there FOBs, fresh off the boat. So, you know, you can see the roti and the lassi and in the flask and achar. An Indian contractor paying off a Mexican worker. An old-timer with his portrait when he first arrived in a turban. This was the last surviving member, I believe, of the Gadar party. And for those who don't know, the Gadar party was people from outside trying to help the Indian independence movement by sending money, even tried sending guns. And then you had a lot of mixed marriages between Mexicans and Indians. And I met people by the name of Mario Singh, for example. And it has a historical reason that after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, in reprisal, the American government wanted to take away lands of all the Japanese that were in the US. But for some reason, this legislation got applied to all Asians, so Chinese, Koreans, Indians, of course the Japanese, their lands were going to be taken away. But the Indians were quite smart. They married the Mexicans who they worked with on the farm in the fields and transferred their properties in the Mexican wives' names. And then you have the bloodlines sort of diluting even further, where you have a Mexican-Indian boy marrying a Venezuelan girl. And of course, you know, the whole story of the Gujarati motel. And in New York, you have the India Day Parade, and which culminates at the end of 23rd Street, Madison Avenue, where then you have dance performances and speeches and singing. In the San Francisco area, in Marin, there's quite a thriving community of artists, dancers, musicians. Zakir Hussain lives there. This is Chitresh Das with his all-blonde Kathak troupe. Bikram Chaudhary, who's patented hot yoga. And the tri-state is kind of flooded with all sorts of gurus. These are Jain gurus eating vegetarian tacos. And Pratapadityapon, he was then the curator of the LA County Museum, the Asian collection. Steve Banerjee, who owned and ran Chippendales, and Chippendales is a male strip club. And he died very tragically. It's a very strange story where he sent hitmen to a rival club owner to kill him. The owners of the Hollywood Wax Museum.
No, what happened to it? They went to the rival club, they killed him.
They killed the rival club owner, and then there was a whole process of inquiry, and he went to jail, and there was going to be a plea bargain, but he killed himself in jail so that his property and club would not be taken away, and went to the wife. Susie Coelho, who was once married to Sammy Bono. She would be gone?
Yes, father was George Coelho,
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
an intellectual. Went to Harvard.
I don't know. I think they are East Indians. James Ritika. And then I did a lot of the scientific community, Dr. Kumar Patel, and I wound up as, I think, CTO of Lucent Technologies, but in 1987, this was the kind of cutting edge of video digital imaging, which now anybody can do, maybe even on their cell phone, so. And that's the computer room where he's standing. Morjani, who had the Vanderbilt Jeans label. The many floats and parades.
What year was this, father?
1987, 88.
Which bill are they opposing?
Sorry?
What bill were they opposing?
I guess this was something to do with immigration.
Married brothers, sisters from migrating
The law
on
was
my
changed in
passport.
81.
Mataji with her hand. That's at the South Street Seaport, Diwali Mela in New York. Guys hanging posters. Again, yeah, I started the Naga project, another sort of long project in 1989, and this was a sort of inner call again from my father when he left Burma and came as a child. I remember these stories that he told us when we were very young about the Naga tribes and their ways. One of it was salt hanging from their rooftops, rock salt wrapped in banana leaves. And then there was another story about how they ate dog. So these things sort of, stayed in my head. And as I grew up in my teens, I met young Naga boys and girls who came to study in Delhi. And I somehow liked their vibe. There was something about them which was really very, earthy and basic and nice. So with them, I started to go up into the Naga Hills, but it wasn't till 89 that I actually started to work. In fact, in 88, I had a Time Life book assignment to do the Nagas, but even before I signed the contract, the whole series got cancelled. It was like Great Tribes of the World. So the Naga Hills is about 6,000 feet at the higher levels. And from me, I was looking at the Naga tribes as a whole group, which is from Arunachal Pradesh into Nagaland into Manipur.